All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating today. A subject, well, I think we all think about it, but maybe not that deeply. The origin of death. We've got some excerpts from a religious study guide. It tackles this big topic, death, through a biblical lens.
Yeah.
So are you ready to see what this ancient text has to say about, well, something we all experience?
I think it's safe to say death is a little more than just, biology doing its thing.
Yeah.
This source material, it frames death as separation.
Oh, interesting.
And it gets really profound when it starts talking about 3 different types of death.
3 types. Okay, now that's intriguing. I'll admit, when I think about death, it's usually the straightforward kind, the lights out at end of story kind.
Right.
But let's start with how this source material defines that first type, spiritual death. What is that all about?
Well, think about the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve, they're living in paradise, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Then they disobey God's command. And that act of disobedience right there, that causes immediate spiritual death. It's a separation from God, a break in their perfect connection.
Okay, so they messed up, but it's not like they physically died right then and there.
Right.
What are the immediate consequences? Like, how does the source describe what happened next?
Well, the source points us to Genesis 3:7-13.
Okay.
And suddenly, Adam and Eve, they become aware of their nakedness and they feel shame.
Wow.
They hide from God. They're afraid. And then they even start blaming each other. Their relationship, that once perfect relationship, it's fractured.
So it's less about them ceasing to exist,
Right.
and more about this radical shift in their relationships with God, with each other, even with themselves.
Yeah.
Like a ripple effect of broken connection.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second type of death, the one that we're maybe more familiar with.
Right.
Physical death. The source uses Adam's 930-year lifespan as an example. He lived a long time. But eventually, his body, it succumbed to the natural process of decay.
Yeah.
And the text implies that this physical death is a direct result of that initial disobedience, that first separation from God back in the garden.
Okay, so we have disobedience leading to spiritual death.
Right.
Which then sets the stage for physical death. But you mentioned a third type. What's the deal with this eternal death?
That's where it gets really interesting. The source material, it only hints at eternal death, describes it as a future consequence, something that's explored more deeply later in the biblical narrative.
Okay, so bit of a cliffhanger there.
It is.
All right, so we have these 3 talks of death, all stemming from that first act of disobedience. But how does this ancient story connect to us? We're living thousands of years later.
Well, this is where Romans 5:20 Eve comes in. Written centuries after Genesis, it reflects on Adam and Eve's transgression and its impact on all of humanity. It suggests that their actions have this ripple effect. It reaches across generations, affects us in 2 key ways.
Okay, let's dive into those. What's the first way we're affected?
The first is inherited sinful nature. The source describes it as being born with a predisposition towards sin. Because of Adam's disobedience, we inherit this tendency, even though we weren't there in the garden. It's like we're hardwired to make similar choices.
So it's not about being predetermined to sin,
Right.
but having this inherent leaning towards it, like inheriting a family trait.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And the second way we're affected is inherited death. This means the curse of death in all its forms, spiritual, physical, and eternal.
Okay.
It's passed down through the generations. It's a consequence that echoes through time.
That's a pretty heavy concept. So does this mean we're all doomed because of what happened back then? Is there no escaping this cycle of separation and death?
Well, that's where the source material starts to reveal a more complex picture. It introduces the serpent. And it hints that this serpent, it might represent something far more significant than a literal snake.
Ooh, I love when things get symbolic. What might this serpent represent?
The source suggests it could be a rebellious angel.
Yeah.
Or even Satan himself, working through the snake to tempt Adam and Eve. It adds a whole new dimension to the story.
So there's a deeper spiritual conflict playing out beneath the surface.
Exactly. And what happens to the serpent is significant. It's cursed by God, condemned to crawl on its belly and eat dust.
Right.
On a literal level, it's punishment.
Right.
But the source, it implies a symbolic interpretation as well.
What kind of symbolic meaning?
It could represent the ultimate defeat and humiliation of the serpent,
Right.
of evil itself, like a foreshadowing of things to come.
So even in the midst of all this talk about death and separation, there's a hint of hope, a promise of a future victory.
That's right. It's called the proto-evangelium, found in Genesis 3.15. It's like a ray of light breaking through the darkness.
Wow.
A cryptic message of hope and future triumph over the forces that brought death into the world.
Okay, so we have death is separation, 3 types of death, a mysterious serpent, and this cryptic promise.
Yeah.
This is a lot to unpack, but where do guilt, fear, and shame fit into all this?
Those emotions, they're at the heart of how spiritual death manifests in our lives.
Okay.
They're not just fleeting feelings. They have a profound impact on how we experience the world, how we relate to others, how we relate to ourselves.
That's where we'll be up next time. Stay tuned, deep divers.
Welcome back, deep divers. Last time, we left off with that cliffhanger, the proto-evangelium, that mysterious promise of future victory over the forces that brought death into the world.
Right. And to fully grasp that promise, I think we need to understand how those forces, how they're at work in our lives, right now.
Yeah, I'm ready to explore that. We talked about guilt, fear, and shame and consequences of that spiritual death.
How does this source, how does it connect these kind of abstract emotions to the reality of our daily lives?
Yeah.
How do they play out?
Well, consider guilt. It's more than just feeling bad about a mistake, right?
Yeah.
The source, it describes it as this heavy weight.
Yeah.
And it can lead to some pretty destructive behaviors.
Like what kind of behaviors?
Think about procrastination. Sometimes we put things off, and it's not just laziness, It's because deep down we feel unworthy of success.
Wow.
That's guilt manifesting as self-sabotage. Or consider people-pleasing. We exhaust ourselves trying to make everyone happy because we're terrified of disappointing others.
Yeah.
A fear that's often rooted in guilt.
Wow. That makes a lot of sense. I definitely experienced both of those things. Like guilt can hold us back from really living fully,
Yeah, exactly. And then there's fear. The source material, it connects fear to anxiety. That feeling of unease and apprehension that can be so paralyzing. It can keep us from taking risks, from pursuing our dreams, even from being honest in our relationships.
Yeah, fear can definitely be a barrier to connection, When we're afraid of being judged or rejected, we hold back. And that creates distance between ourselves and others.
That's a great point. And then there's shame, perhaps the most, insidious of the 3. It attacks our sense of worth, leads to self-criticism, self-punishment, even withdrawal from others.
Yeah, shame makes us feel like we're not good enough, like we don't deserve, love or belonging. I can see how that would push people away from connection and community.
It's a powerful force. What's interesting is how the source material points out that these emotions, while universal, they can play out differently in various cultures.
Oh, okay.
Some cultures are more guilt-oriented. Others emphasize shame. And some prioritize fear as a primary, motivator.
Can you give us some examples of how those cultural variations might play out? Like, how would it look different?
Absolutely. Let's contrast Western, individualistic cultures with a collectivist culture like Japan.
Okay.
In the West, where individual responsibility is so emphasized, guilt often leads to a focus on confession, seeking forgiveness. It's about making amends for wrongdoing. But in Japan, where social harmony is paramount, shame is a much, much stronger force.
Right.
Failure to meet social expectations brings shame not only on the individual, but on the entire family or community.
That's a really striking difference. So the same underlying emotion can manifest in very different ways. It just depends on the cultural context.
Exactly. And all of this ties back to this concept of death as separation. These emotions, born from that initial break with God in the garden, they continue to drive wedges between us and others, between us and ourselves, and ultimately between us and our Creator.
So even though we weren't there in the garden, we're still living with the consequences of that first separation. It's like this ripple effect that touches, I don't know, every aspect of our lives.
That's a great way to put it, but remember that glimmer of hope,
Mm.
that proto-evangelium we talked about?
Oh yeah, the cryptic message of future victory. I'm eager to learn more about that.
It's a fascinating piece of the puzzle. Some interpret it as foreshadowing a single messianic figure who will come to conquer evil and break the power of sin and death. Others see it as a more collective effort, with humanity as a whole rising up to defeat the forces that keep us separated.
So is it a lone hero or a collective triumph?
This source material, it leaves that open to interpretation, but what's interesting is how it challenges us to think about our own role in this cosmic drama. Are we passive bystanders just waiting for someone to save us, or do we have agency, a responsibility to participate in this fight against separation and death?
That's a powerful question. It makes me think about how our choices, even the seemingly small ones, they can either contribute to further separation or move us towards connection and healing.
Precisely. But before we dive deeper into the implications of the proto-evangelium, there's another intriguing detail about the serpent that we should explore. When God confronts Adam and Eve, he never actually addresses the serpent directly. It's as if the serpent, representing temptation and deceit, isn't even worthy of a response.
That's an interesting observation.
Yeah.
What do you make of God's silence toward the serpent?
It could be interpreted as a way of diminishing the serpent's power. By refusing to engage with it, God is essentially saying, you have no authority here. Your words are meaningless.
It's like God is focused on Adam and Eve, on their choices and their accountability, rather than giving the tempter any legitimacy.
Exactly. And there's another subtle but telling detail. When God confronts Adam shifts blame onto both Eve and God himself.
Oh, wow.
He says, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree."
Wow. So he's not only blaming Eve, but he's implying that God is partially responsible because he's the one who gave Eve to Adam. That's pretty bold considering God created, everything.
It certainly is. And it reveals something profound about the nature of sin. It often leads us to distort reality, to project blame outwards instead of taking ownership of our actions.
It's like a defense mechanism, a way to shield ourselves from the painful consequences of our choices.
Exactly. And the source material, it points out that this blame-shifting tendency, it's something we still struggle with today.
I can definitely relate to that. It's so much easier to blame, others or even circumstances than to face up to our own mistakes.
It's a human tendency, for sure. But the source material, it challenges us to move beyond blame, towards a more honest assessment of our own role in creating separation and disharmony in our lives.
So it's not about wallowing in guilt or shame, but about recognizing our own agency, our capacity to make choices that lead to connection and healing.
That's a great way to summarize it. And this leads us back to the serpent and the curse it receives. Remember, it's condemned to crawl on its belly and eat dust. On a literal level, it seems like a straightforward punishment.
Right.
But the source material suggests that it might also have a deeper symbolic meaning.
I'm all ears. Tell me more about this symbolic interpretation.
Well, think about the imagery. Crawling on the belly and eating dust. It evokes a sense of degradation, of humiliation. It could be interpreted as a symbolic representation of the serpent's ultimate defeat, of the inevitable triumph of good over evil.
It's like the serpent's fate foreshadows the eventual downfall of everything it represents.
Yeah.
Temptation, deceit, separation.
Precisely. And it's interesting that the source material points out that we don't actually know how they moved before the fall. Maybe they slithered upright or even climbed trees. The point is, this curse, it might not be about a physical change in the serpent's form, but rather a symbolic representation of its downfall.
I like that interpretation. It adds another layer of depth to this story.
And that symbolism is key to understanding the proto-evangelium, that first glimmer of good news. The source material, it delves into the different interpretations of this prophecy. Some see it as a promise of a future individual who will conquer the serpent Satan, while others interpret it as a collective effort,
Mhm.
with humanity as a whole rising up to defeat the forces of evil.
So it could be a single hero or a group effort, both fighting for that restoration of wholeness and connection.
Exactly. But there's another crucial element to the prophecy that we shouldn't overlook. The source material, it points out that even though victory is promised, it won't be without cost.
Mhm.
The descendant of the woman will bruise the serpent's head, but their own heel will be bruised as well.
That suggests that the path to overcoming evil won't be easy, that there will be sacrifices and suffering along the way.
That's a really important point. It reminds us that the fight against separation and death, against the forces that keep us from experiencing true connection and wholeness, it's not for the faint of heart.
Hmm.
It requires courage, perseverance, and a willingness to endure hardship.
This is incredibly thought-provoking.
Mm.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. The origins of death, the power of guilt, fear, and shame, the mystery of the serpent, and the promise of future
And
victory.
we're not done yet. Next time we'll explore how different cultures grapple with these complex emotions and delve even deeper into the implications of the proto-evangelium for our lives today. Stay tuned, deep divers.
Welcome back, deep divers. We've been on quite the journey, huh? Exploring the origin of death, the three types of death, the power of those emotions, guilt, fear, and shame, and that mysterious proto-evangelium, that glimmer of hope.
It has been fascinating, yeah. And in this final part, I think it's worth circling back to those emotions, guilt, fear, and shame, and how they show up differently across cultures. Remember, the source material hinted that some cultures lean more towards guilt, while others emphasize shame or even fear.
Right, like how we contrasted a Western individualistic culture, with a more collectivist one, like Japan. In the West, guilt, it often leads to confession, seeking forgiveness. It's about making amends for individual wrongdoing. But in Japan, shame plays a much bigger role. Like if you fail to meet social expectations, it brings shame not just on you, but on your whole family, your community even.
Exactly. It's such a powerful example of how the same emotion, at its core, can express itself in totally different ways.
Hmm.
Just depends on the cultural context. It really makes you wonder if those cultural differences, if they impact how people experience separation and death too.
That is a really thought-provoking connection. It's not just about death as a biological event then, but about the social and cultural implications, right? Being separated from loved ones, from community, even from your sense of belonging.
Precisely. It makes this whole concept of death as separation even richer, more nuanced.
So how does all this tie back to the proto-evangelium then, that promise of future victory?
Well, let's look at some of the interesting details, linguistic details, the source material highlights about that prophecy. The Hebrew word for offspring, for example, it can refer to either an individual or a collective group.
So that's why there's this debate about whether it's talking about a single messianic figure, someone who will conquer evil, or if it's more about humanity as a whole, all of us rising up to defeat the forces of separation and death.
Exactly. The language is open to multiple interpretations, but here's where it gets really interesting. The source material points out that the Hebrew verb for bruise, it's in the singular form.
Wait, so if the verb is singular, wouldn't that suggest a single actor, someone delivering the final blow? Doesn't that lean towards the single hero interpretation?
It's certainly a point in favor of that interpretation, yeah. Some scholars, they use that grammatical detail to argue for a single messianic figure. But even with that singular verb, there are still those who believe the prophecy is pointing towards a collective effort. It's a complex theological debate. No easy answers.
Oh, the joys of biblical interpretation, always more layers to uncover. But regardless of whether it's a lone hero or a group triumph, the source material seems to emphasize that humanity, we have a crucial role to play in overcoming evil and separation. We're not just passive bystanders waiting for something to happen.
Absolutely. That's what makes the proto-evangelium so powerful. It suggests that even though we inherit this legacy of sin and death, we're not doomed to just repeat the mistakes of the past. We have the power to choose differently, to choose a path that leads to connection, to wholeness, and ultimately to life.
It's a powerful reminder that our choices really do matter. Even small acts of kindness or forgiveness, compassion, those things, they can chip away at the walls of separation that we've built around ourselves and contribute to a larger movement, towards healing and restoration.
Beautifully said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the origin of death.
It has been an incredible journey. We've covered so much ground, from the Garden of Eden to those complex emotions of guilt, fear, and shame, to that mystery of the serpent, and of course, the hope of the proto-evangelium.
We've wrestled with some really challenging questions, uncovered layers of meaning that you might not see on a surface reading of the text.
So as we wrap up this episode, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I hope this deep dive has encouraged them to think about death differently, not just as this biological ending, but as a concept, with so many layers, spiritual, cultural implications.
I second that. And I hope it sparked some curiosity, to keep exploring these ideas, all the different ways death has shaped our stories, both individually and collectively.
Maybe even more importantly, I hope it's given them a sense of hope, a sense of agency. Even though death is a reality we all face, we're not powerless. Our choices, our actions, our relationships, they all have this potential to bring more life, more connection, more love into the world.
That is a beautiful and empowering message to end on. So deep divers, as you go back out into the world, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking deeper understanding, and never underestimate the power you have, the power of your choices to make a difference, both in your own life and in the lives of those around you.